Hello, and welcome back to the Will I Vike It podcast. Today, my guest is Jameson Foster, who otherwise known as Skuzzlebutt. How else they might know you as the Nordic Sound Channel. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
man
I
with
wear
many
many
hats.
hats. Yeah, with same exact same phrase. Yeah, man with many hats.
Yeah. So I've written a few questions to ask you. I've tried to cover a broad overview of all those things,
Yeah, sure,
really.
man.
I feel a little bit awkward kind of interviewing a musician who's also an
Oh, how come?
ethnomusicologist. So I'm asking you questions about music, and that's
Yep.
basically what you do. So it's like the pressure's on.
Oh no, that's not that kind of musicologist. It's actually
Yeah.
the deeper you get into it, the more you realize that anything really goes. So
Yeah. So yeah, I thought we'd start off with that really. So maybe
okay.
you could explain a bit about why you became an ethnomusicologist, or even maybe probably better to start with what is an ethnomusicologist, right? Because
Yeah. So it's a big fancy word. And it's the reason that's a funny question to ask is because ethnomusicologists themselves have actually spent quite a bit of the last 100 years or so arguing over what ethnomusicology is. Um,
okay.
and because the thing is, it comes from just to sort of like say where it comes from, right? Is that there was musicology first that was primarily a German pursuit, like in the 19th century, where it was just Germans loved talking about why German music was great. Um, but then some people, especially as the world started to become a little bit more globalized, and you started to be able to interact with cultures from around the world more easily. A branch of that sort of branched off to sort of it was called comparative musicology to sort of compare, right? And that was the main goal of the early discipline was to compare music from around the world. But the ultimate goal of that was to compare it to to better understand why German music was better, right? I'm oversimplifying it just for the purpose of the podcast, but
Sure.
but that's sort of where ethnomusicology comes from, is comparative musicology. But then the phonograph gets invented. People are able to record music and actually listen to music from around the world without having to rely on writing it down, right? Um,
Mm.
and really, I'll just fast forward to the 50s after World War II and the world as we know it kind of started to come together. Ethnomusicologists started to look at themselves and say, well, we don't really want to compare anymore. We sort of see where that gets us. So what can we do that's more productive? How can we evaluate what we do and sort of like make it fit into what we want the discipline to be, right? To really look at ourselves in the mirror. And a lot of people landed on a whole different bunch of directions, but I like to think that what we've landed on by now is that ethnomusicologists are we take a lot from anthropology and from sociology and from archaeology and history to really look at music as a part of culture. Whereas music theory, for instance, looks at music on the page and like looks at the mathematics of like why this chord works, why this sounds better than this, for lack of a better way to explain it. Ethnomusicologists are really focused on how music operates through people in culture, like as it's experienced, and that that comes together in a lot of different ways. Sometimes people focus on just the music from a specific region, just the music from a specific culture, a specific style of music. I kind of do a little bit of both, where I'm an ethnomusicologist that focuses on just Nordic music in general. Um, and that can mean anything from I'm a huge fan of the classical music of Norway, like Edvard Grieg and Ole Bull and all of them. Also the folk music, but then also at the same time, huge metalhead. So just Nordic music in general is sort of what I focus on as an ethnomusicologist. If I were to say that I'm looking at how music operates within and through culture, right? Like, what does it mean to the people who make it and listen to it?
Cool. So what made you decide you wanted to do that as your focus, your main focus? Is it your main? I suppose it's your main
No, it
focus.
is. It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
It's kind of a funny story because I was a terrible student in college, awful student. Okay, I didn't. I was a music major. I didn't practice my main instrument enough. I really just suffered from like just a lack of motivation, not really finding anything that really gripped me. But then a
Yeah.
big rite of passage for music majors is we have to take a class that's just called Music After 1700. And it's kind of the gauntlet that music students get thrown through, where, after all this time of just taking music theory, ear training, your electives, what have you, this class like really forces you to not only read a lot but to write a lot, and it's really the only time music majors have to do any writing. And this happens in your third year. And it's taught by the musicologist at this New Hampshire State College was is Joe Darby, Dr. Darby. He was probably the most important person in my development, getting me from being just sort of like a I don't know, sort of like a brain dead, apathetic college student into really learning that I loved looking at music in that way, right? So I was music theory is whatever, ear training is whatever, composition is fun. But that class for the first time made me look at someone like uh, Handel or Bach or Mozart, um, and look at why their music was the way that it was within the context of the culture that they lived in and where they situate themselves historically. And so that was like a really new, interesting way for me to look at it. But then the big part of that class is you choose your own topic that you write a term paper on. And that's the first time you really write. It has to be 20 pages, where I write that in my sleep now as a PhD student. But when I was 19, 20, like that's a big deal to write 20 pages. And I chose Edvard Grieg because he's a Norwegian composer that I absolutely loved. For anyone listening, he wrote the famous pieces like bum 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 bum. Right. So like he
I'm
wrote
glad you did
all
that,
this.
because I'll be honest, I
Yeah.
didn't know him.
No, yeah. I know. And he also wrote like the very cliche morning music that you hear like Looney Tunes and stuff. But the reason I wrote about it was because I was very curious about Scandinavia, but I had never heard about any Scandinavian music in my entire time as a music student. You're primarily looking at like French, German, Italian, English composers, Russian composers too. Um, but my big question was, where's Norway? Where's Sweden? Where's Finland in all of this, right? Um,
Mm,
and that was really my gateway drug, where that was the first time as a student I actually felt like I cared, or that like I was really excited to do something. And
yeah.
that just ended up bringing me down the rabbit hole, that then brought me to where I am today. And it all started with just that dinky little paper that I wrote. And yeah, it just turned out that for me, learning and studying and just sort of poking and prodding at how music operates culturally and historically and what it means for the people that make it and listen to it and all of that, that's really what interests me about music mostly.
So can we learn, I don't know if this is a stupid question, can we learn things about a culture through music that we wouldn't learn otherwise?
Oh yeah, that's actually one of the biggest, one of the biggest arguments for the importance of ethnomusicology is that, there's that saying that music is the universal language, but ethnomusicologists kind of spend a little too much time picking that apart at why it's not really that true. But there's merit to the phrase in the sense that we all have music, and in a way, because we all have it, and because there is something about it where, because it's a sonic phenomenon, it's easier to relate to than, let's say literature or visual art. Music resonates with all of us on a very deep level, and the fact that we all have it allows an easy way for us to understand other people. Um, where in film and in cinema, sometimes that's exploited to like stereotypically use music to, when you get to a desert scene in a movie, what you're going to hear, and it's like a caricature in a way. So that's a more negative
Yeah.
way it can be used, but a positive way is that music is a way that bridges divides between cultures. And not only that, but music also expresses something very deep and very intimate about ourselves and about the community we live in, about the culture we live in. Um, and so I would say that yeah, music is pretty important as a way to like understand other cultures and other people. If we want to look at specifically in the context of Will I Vike It, how
Yeah.
many people use music as a way to learn about Scandinavia and as a way to, um, as sort of an entry point, right? Because otherwise, like, where do you start if you want to learn about it? But sometimes people will hear music like Vardruna and they'll know, like, wow, I want to learn more about where this comes from. Why is this music like this? And those are all ethnomusicological questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, music does a lot for helping us understand people from various different backgrounds, especially in the United States where I'm from. Music has been one of the most important factors in bridging like the really big and serious cultural and racial divides we have here in the country. And music has been a huge part of bridging those divides. I'm thinking like jazz, uh, country, and bluegrass in particular have been pretty important. Rock and roll in the '60s, of course, right? So yeah, music's always been a way to understand other people and sort of find common ground, I think is a good way to put it.
So when did you first, at what age, I guess, did you first become interested in music? Was it like a specific artist, a genre? What
Oh
was it
yeah.
that?
So mine's pretty straightforward. I'm from the Guitar Hero generation.
Yeah,
When Guitar Hero was like everyone had the plastic controller in the room,
sure.
and so when you go to a friend's house and all that, and so that was sort of the first major way that I engaged with music growing up was in middle school. That's just what friends would do. But I always noticed that I always was way more into playing it than all my other friends, and sometimes it would actually boil down to everyone sits around while Jameson plays Guitar Hero. And it did, and that's a really funny. I don't think I've ever actually actually talked about this before. But from there, that introduced me to my really first experience with rock and metal. And it didn't take very long from there for me to just fall absolutely in love with two bands primarily, and that is AC/DC and Metallica.
Yeah.
And AC/DC, that was pretty much all I listened to middle school. But by the time I was in high school, I almost exclusively listened to Metallica. Um, and it just did, yeah, just they're even today, if I put on one of their records over here, it's just like I feel like a kid again. And yeah, so that was probably the first time I really cared about music was that, and that band is the reason I picked up the bass, which is my main instrument. Just because Metallica's bass player in the '80s, Cliff Burton, was just like a absolute monster of a musician, and so he played the instrument in a way that made me ask my dad, "What instrument is that?" And so my dad, he has a wall of guitars, and he was like, "Oh, well, it's this one, the one with four strings." And so from then on, I played bass. Um, but also, I will say, there was also this really weird side quest I was always going on, even in high school, where I did have like this nagging interest in folk music, but I didn't really know where to go with it or what to do with it or how to learn more about it.
Yeah.
So I'm from Maryland, it's a state that has a very high German and Irish population. Um, and Irish in particular, there are a lot of Irish bars around Baltimore and around Maryland, and they would always have Irish music nights. And even as a kid, I loved the Irish music nights. Um, but that would be a thread that I wouldn't really pick up until college, especially when the internet started to be to be a better way to learn about new music. But yeah, so I would say until college, it was primarily heavy metal, and that was sort of what raised me.
Nice. So do
Yeah.
you have any particular memorable experiences from researching Nordic music? Perhaps a particular
Oh,
performance you've been to or meeting a significant musician?
so this is going to be something that you and I can definitely relate to. It was Midgard's Blow 2021.
Yeah.
Was or 2022. Which one
20,
was it?
yeah, 22, I think. I
22.
don't think it
22.
happened in 21, did it?
No, it didn't. It didn't. That's why I had to
Yeah.
pivot. So 2022, right? Up until that point, I'd seen Vardruna here in Denver. I'm in Colorado now, and and I saw some really awesome performances when I was at Conservatory of Sibelius, Grieg, and all these other Scandinavian composers. But I my love for Vardruna was always from a distance.
Yeah.
Just I loved listening to it, but I didn't really something wasn't clicking with why I liked listening to it. All I know is that I loved it, right? But when we were at Midgard's Blow 2022, um, just something about that entire festival experience just put all of this interest that I had in, you can call this Viking music scene or music that's
Yeah.
being explicitly made to evoke a historical period or, an imaginary version of a better time. Um, that was my first real time seeing not just the music itself in its proper setting, because Heilong also, I think that was one of their best shows too, was that year at Midgarsblot. Um,
Yeah.
it was also seeing the community around it. For me, I'm thinking specifically the stuff that was going on around the bonfire. People can watch me have this revelation real time on the little vlogs I did on the channel during that festival, where I was making a habit of every morning I would sort of do a little vlog and post it, and that was actually what kind of blew up the channel because up until then I was a classical music podcast where I sort of like went through. I was
Yeah.
sort of like just telling the story of Nordic music history,
That's
but
quite
that
a
was
pivot.
really the yeah, I know, right? Because it was just out of nowhere. It was very sudden, and it was in a lot of ways also kind of felt like I found my people, and I really wanted to sort of like do my part in creating a space for people to come and learn about Nordic music while also, just talking about it, relating.
Mm.
But that festival was, yeah, not just the really big performances of both Varjuna and Heilung that stuck with me, but it was also seeing the between moments of how seeing other people like me, right? Because that was my first time, even living in Baltimore and then New Hampshire and then now Colorado. There are not a lot of people like us, right? And so that was my first time really being in a setting where I was like, these, I feel like I belong somewhere. And so it was also seeing those in between moments of how people acted like a real community around the Utgard camp and the bonfire,
Mm.
the music going into the early hours of the morning. That whole thing was just super transformative for me in following through on. I really did not mean to thread the needle this well, but following through on that music as culture, following through on how is this music making meaning for people and by people, right?
Mm.
Um, and that was just sort of like right into the deep end. This is what it does for people right around that bonfire, right? So yeah, I would say Midgard's Blow 2022 was really the most impactful and meaningful experience for me studying Nordic music as as a scholar, but also like as a huge fan and dork about it.
It's kind of fun, isn't it? Like how things just fall into place sometimes. So you're just going along doing your thing and suddenly go, oh wait, I'm doing this now.
Mhm. It is,
Yeah.
it is really funny because, I will say, if someone's wondering why I was studying Varjuna and all of that before I actually really got it,
Mm.
it's because, like, in a lot of ways, what Varjuna is doing is just a continuation of this really long history in Norway of the country of Norway using music to advocate for itself. Um, you know, uh, Norway was not independent until 1905, and until then it was really music that Norway was using along with other things to advocate for its own culture and its own identity, and using it to show other, take that music, play it around the world to be like, this is Norway. And that's what Vardruna was doing, is doing as well, is in a lot of ways, tying this into your previous question,
Mm.
Vardruna is how a lot of people are getting to know Norwegian culture.
Yeah.
Um, I know that that's a pressure that Einar is probably not entirely comfortable with, but that is what how a lot of people even
Yeah.
learn where Norway is on a map. Um, and so, sort of seeing how Vardruna is continuing this centuries long trend of music being used to express a particularly Norwegian identity through music, and sort of how people are making meaning with that, and how people who aren't even from Scandinavia are connecting with that kind of music expression.
Yeah. I've never really thought about why I like a band. Do you know what I mean? Like I've never gone that deep.
Yep.
I either like something or I don't. It was like so with Vordruna, for me, what it was is the TV series Vikings.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And there's this
Me.
music playing in the background, and I'm
Mhm.
like, who is this? And so I start Googling, and then I go, oh, right, it's this band. Okay, it's this guy, Ina Solik. Okay. Oh, they're playing a gig in London. So we went to London and watched them. And we met someone that did reenactment, which got us
Mhm.
into reenactment. So again, it's like stuff just fell into place and
Mhm.
spiraled to where it is now.
Yeah, and
It's
that's sort of, that's how it goes for for many of us, as you say, it just falls into place. And I think it's just an important case of, just follow what you want to do, and eventually things will
Mm.
hopefully come into place. Not everyone's so fortunate for that to happen, but it's even funnier when you consider that, you know, I'm remembering the reason I was telling that anecdote in the first place was because, I had yet to really be a part of the culture. I was just studying it, in a very typical, how does Vardruna sit into the broader history of Nordic music, right? And
Yeah.
I was having a coffee with Matthias Nordvig, and he just casually said, "You want a Midgardsblot?" And I was like, "What the hell did you just say? I don't know what that word is." And he was like, "No, dude, it's this festival." And both Vardruna and Heilung are headlining it. I had never been to Norway before. I've been to Germany, but that would have been my first time actually going to Scandinavia. So there were so many reasons for me to take him up on that offer to, like, tag along, or go to this festival. And that's
Mm.
how serendipitous it was for me. If I didn't know Matthias, I never probably would have even found out that I probably would have known the festival existed, but without that direct friend telling me, "I'm going, you should come too,"
Yeah.
that also wouldn't have fallen into place. And that's what actually got me there in the first place.
So for us, it was still the Wardruna thing. So after the gig in
Yep.
London, someone mentioned that they were playing this festival, Midgard Blot. It was the second year of the
Yep.
festival, and we just decided, like, my wife was pregnant at the time, and we were just like, fuck it, like, last chance, like, let's just go. And so we went. We spent a week in Oslo, and then we sort of traveled down and spent a few days at the festival, and then came home again. And I've gone most years since on my own, mostly because she doesn't like flying, so
Yeah.
it's generally just me. But
Yeah, man. And, yeah, it's just such an important thing because, for a lot of us, we go to that festival to see Virgin or Heilung in 2022. But then along the way, we're also introduced to all these other incredible musicians who are working in that same vein,
mm,
right? That same style of music. And for a lot of
yeah,
people who went there, they also discovered, they might have seen the names come up, but, like Nibala, Kjellbråten, Folkeborg, Nord Vinden. And when I was learning that not a lot of people knew who these bands were, but they were so into Vardruna and Heilung, that was sort of when I looked at the surge of popularity of the Nordic Sound Channel, and I was like, I think this is my opportunity to follow through on what I've always wanted this channel to be, and that is a place for people to come to learn about Nordic music in in a way that they can hopefully trust, right? Because the internet is a kiss and a curse. You have a whole bunch of information, but with very little context. And for that reason, the internet can be a really dangerous place to go if you want to learn about a historical culture or something like that. You
yeah.
never know if you're getting good information. And really, and I noticed that was especially true with Nordic music. This is something that I actually get to the point of just like old man yelling at the clouds about on the channel quite a bit, is just like how little Nordic music comes up if you Google Nordic music. It's a lot of things that are dressed up like Nordic music, but it's not.
Right.
And so I've just really used that as an opportunity to be like, I can have these people on the channel, like, our friends Benny,
Yeah.
Kjell, Gustav, Runehild, all of these wonderful people, and, really try and create a place for people to come and hear from these musicians, not so much some American claiming to know what he's talking about and you don't know, right? The main draw, or the main purpose of me, has always been to, like, give a platform to these musicians to sort of tell their own story. And to me, that's ethnomusicology in a nutshell, is letting these musicians tell their own story, and using my role as an ethnomusicologist to give them a microphone, or give them a megaphone, even, or just a platform or a place to tell their story.
So does that, where you've led into accidentally creating the podcast, does that now feed back into your PhD itself? Are you actually
Yeah,
kind of
it
using?
definitely, because, as I said, ethnomusicology is different from so many of the other music majors, that, in the sense that it relies on you talking to people. An
Yeah.
ethnomusicologist, if you look at what ethno means, ethnomusicology is the dumbest word, because it means that you study people music. That's, if you break down ethnomusicology, it means the study of people music, right? And
Yeah.
but the reason that the ethno is there is because the priority has always been talking to people and doing field work is what we call it, where you actually, you go to where the music's being played, you learn from the people who play it. And so I think the channel really became a symbiotic relationship where I was not only giving a platform to these musicians who I think really needed one, or at least I think really needed one, because I just think that their life experiences and their story is both very valuable but also misunderstood in a lot of ways. So that symbiotic relationship of giving a platform for these musicians to talk, while at the same time, I'm also getting to do the job of an ethnomusicologist, where I'm getting to talk to these musicians and learn the little details of why they do what they do, where they come from, what their drive is, and all that sort of thing. So 100%, it all feeds back into what I'm doing as an ethnomusicologist. And the reason it's so important to me is because the more that I talk to these musicians and make sure that they have the spotlight rather than me, is it makes me feel a little bit more comfortable and confident that I'm trying to be a responsible ethnomusicologist and sort of letting them speak, right? And learning directly from them rather than me talking for them or something like that. It makes me feel like what I'm getting is a little bit more of like more reliable and responsible scholarship on the whole field of music.
So are you the only person that studies Nordic ethnomusicology?
No, but I will say that I think I'm the okay, I will not say only, but I think I'm one of the few who studies it while also being sympathetic towards it. Um, musicologists and just academics in general, they can be a little stuck in books, right? And I face this firsthand. So if any academics are listening to me, know that I'm talking from experience. I'm not just painting up a caricature of straw man, but like a lot of the things that this music scene does in books, if you're looking at like theory and history, a lot of people don't get it because it doesn't make sense if you're looking at things from like a rational academic point of view. So whereas other academics or whatever might want to look at this field with more of a critical, like, what's nonsensical about it, or what doesn't make sense, or what's contradictory about it, or that sort of thing. That's the more typical academic approach to things. I do know that I'm one of the few who's approaching this music field, this music culture, as an ethnomusicologist who's also a part of it. But there's also, he's on my committee. Ross Hagen, just with Matthias Nordvig, wrote a book, The Ancestral North, that is about this music scene, but they're also a part of it. And that's why I love these guys so much, is because we're sort of studying it and also kind of advocating for it from a more understanding lens. Whereas maybe a whole bunch of scholars or academics might be like, oh, these guys are playing pretend. They're playing make-believe Viking because they are unhappy with their lives or something like that. That very typical, more critical, judgmental lens. So I think there's something valuable to that. There is something valuable to that, of having an outsider's view that's more critical. But I feel like that if that gets the most attention, it's unfair and a little too unsympathetic towards the experiences of the people who are a part of this music scene.
I've seen as well from seeing you on social media. I've sort of noticed that a lot of these artists that you mentioned, like your Bennies and your Skuzzlebutt, and like they have a lot of respect for you as well. They're seeing the work you do, and they do appreciate it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like I as I said, I try to just give a place for them to tell their own story, and I just know firsthand from how the music business works is often you'll do interviews and the journalism outlet or whatever will either chop it up so that it's like barely even what they said anymore, or kind of like misrepresent what they said. I've had a few artists, I'm not going to name names, who have they've been like, look, before you post that interview, I would like to watch it myself to make sure that it's what I said. And of course, I'm like, yeah, please take all the time you need. But just knowing that there are artists who've had experiences where they're like, no, I've had it happen before, where I've done an interview, then they post the interview and they completely took what I said out of context or something like that. So yeah, it's important to sort of my interviews are very rarely edited at all. It's just like there's the information, there's the conversation. So yeah, I'm trying to do my part, because I think this music scene it doesn't need it, but I think this music scene can benefit from an ethnomusicologist or two. I think that's how I'll put it.
I was going to ask whether you've discovered any hidden gems in the Nordic music scene next, but I think I'm assuming based on your experience of Midgardblot and the bands you've mentioned, did you discover people like Folket from Midgardblot?
I had been familiar with them, but there's just something, and this is where again my ethnomusicologist in me is going to really shine bright right here. Is just like, to me, it is so much more important for me to discover music as it's performed, like in its context. It's very difficult for me to pick up an album to discover someone, especially in this music scene where the whole ritual performance aspect is so important. And especially because like if I don't get to know these musicians, it's hard to know like what their game is. You know what I mean? Because they're quite a lot of musicians that were just like, a lot of people like them, but if you look under the hood, I'm kind of like, I don't really trust this or something like that. So for me, I was like familiar with Kjell Broughton, I was familiar with Nabala, familiar with Folketborg to Nordvinden, but there's just something entirely different seeing these musicians perform in the context of a thing like Midgardblot that really it clicks and you just get it, right? But to answer your question of like the gems, to me, and this is something I am talking about on the channel a little bit more and plan to talk about more in the future, is sort of a lot of people think that Vardruna invented this kind of music. And that's because they're just the most culturally relevant. And they're just the big name right now. But even Einar would be the first to say, like, nope, whole lineage of musicians that I've learned from to do this stuff, right? Because he was a black metal drummer. That's where he comes from. And he had to learn from other people. And I think the most important thing is me learning from talking to these musicians who've been around since like the 90s and 80s, where they got so much of their ideas and their inspiration from. This whole Viking music scene goes back decades and actually goes all the way back into like the hippie movement of the 60s. And with that is just so many different bands and musicians that when you actually go into the history of it, musicians who never would have called themselves Viking music ended up being completely foundational to the genre. I know I'm really dorking out about this. I love this question. I really do. So let me just go on for a little bit
No,
longer.
you're fine.
Where, like to me, I'm seeing people discover Harald Foss, who's he was very popular on YouTube, but people are learning more about him because I learned from Kjell Broughton that he was pretty important to sort of approaching music in this Viking market sort of way. But also seeing people who love Vardruna then go to Midgardblot the following year and seeing a band like Garmarna, which is just this incredible like folk rock fusion band from the 90s, who they would have never, they told me, they said, I never would have thought we were Viking music, but people in the Viking music scene are like, no, dude, like they were so influential to me. And then having fans of people like Vardruna or Heilong or Savulo go back and listen to Garmarna and Hedningarna, and this year seeing my generation appreciate Mari Boina, that to me, I think that's what's beautiful about it too, is because again, Vardruna and this whole Viking music thing is being a gateway for people to learn about more Scandinavian bands that have been around for a while, but just because of how Scandinavian culture is, it's just been hard to break out into a more international audience. But that's my favorite part. Those are my hidden eggs. Those are like my hidden little golden nuggets, are those bands that came before Vardruna and Heilung, who've been there forever, are now finally through Vardruna and Heilung getting a little bit more recognition for the awesome music they've been doing for decades.
So what we're really discovering today is that Einar Salvik and Wardruna are the gateway drug to the Viking music scene.
Yeah, and it's true, right? Because you even, you look at the people that Einar learned from, or the people that Einar, respects. I'm using Einar as an example. I'm not the type of person to have his face up on a wall the same way a Rastafarian would have Bob Marley. But I'm just using him as an example, right? If you were to look at the people that he respects and he admires and who he learned from, I would say that it probably feels good for him to like know that he's introducing a wider audience of people to bands and musicians like that.
Yeah, man. just checking the time. So it's getting on a bit. Um, shall we move on and talk a bit about Skuzzlebutt, which
Yeah, man. Let's
for
talk about
anyone,
Skuzzlebutt.
which will sound strange to anyone that's not aware. So,
Yeah.
what is Skuzzlebutt? Let's start there.
So, okay. Let's see, where do I start with this? So, being a musicologist at conservatory where I was never the best musician in the class, not even close, it was always hard for me to, be comfortable with my own self as a musician, just because there was always so many more people who were better than me. And just when you spend as long in a music school as I did, that will sort of like eat at your confidence a little bit. And so I
Mm,
developed this really weird relationship with music where I listen to it, I study it, but when it came to playing it, I was always like, I don't know. I don't really, I think of all of the incredible musicians, and they would hate that I'm talking this way, by the way. I would think of all of these musicians in my class that I was roommates with and just be like, nah, they do it better. What's the point? And a terrible mindset to have. But I couldn't beat it. But then I sort of learned through Heilung, really, like the whole idea of masked performance.
mm,
Um, and I'm also incredibly fortunate enough to here at University of Colorado. I have a colleague from Nigeria who is studying masked music performance, and so I've been learning a lot from her about what masked performance does for musicians. And in taking an African music history course for my degree, I learned that the mask is a way for people to transcend themselves and to take on a different persona. Um, and when I was learning about this, I was kind of like, I think I need that. I think I need to get out of my own head and like just transcend myself,
yeah.
because I got a lot of baggage that's getting in the way. And so Alyssa, my wife, she's an incredible artist. She made this mask for me. Um, and so yeah, so it fit to my face. She made it with, I forget what the material is, but it fit perfectly to my face. And just the mask itself was really inspiring to me. And the instrument that I had picked up by this point is the banjo. And so for anyone listening, Skuzzlebutt is primarily a banjo project. And it was this weird thing where a lot of my background is in bluegrass and American mountain music. And so I play clawhammer banjo, but I also did it with like this Nordic twist. And it was largely a thing that I just did for myself. Just sort of like experimenting with how a banjo can be used to play this neo-pagan dark folk of Viking music sounding thing. Because the banjo is a pretty primitive instrument. It's very simple. It essentially is a frame drum that has strings across it if you think about it. And so I use that as sort of an inspiration to see how I could maybe mix the styles of American roots music with dark folk and pagan music. Um, and it turned out that my very first experiment with that was actually pretty well received. And there's a lesson in it too, because the mask allowed myself to just not really think about myself and more just like play music. And at the same time, the music that I was making was also purely for myself. And if anyone else listened to it and enjoyed it, that would have been a benefit.
Mm,
And 2 years later, I'm like kind of shocked at how many people the music that I make as Skuzzlebutt has resonated with just so many people. And I'm very, I'm very it humbles me, right?
yeah.
But this idea of sort of showing that here's the broader thing that I was looking at, right? Is how are people making meaning with the dark folk genre, with the music of Heilung and Vardruna? And does that meaning necessarily mean that the music that they make has to be Nordic? Because there are a lot of people who are not from Scandinavia, Americans too, who hear Heilung and Vardruna, love sort of like the spirituality side of it, and then turn around and try and make Nordic music. When
Mm,
the philosophy doesn't necessarily mean that you need to make Nordic music. You don't need to pick up a toggle harpa. You don't need to play, langalike or some other Nordic instrument. Make music from where you are and using the sort of the philosophy of Vardruna and Heilung. And that was sort of the experiment that the banjo was, to take the lessons and the philosophy of that style of music, but play it through the music that I play, right? American music. And yeah, it's really an experiment in sort of taking the philosophy, but not necessarily the sound and instruments, and just sort of seeing what I can come up with on my own with the music that I play and that I was brought up with. And so that was how Skuzzlebutt came to be. Was sort of, fusing the worlds of, Nordic neo-spirituality and all of that with American mountain music. But then the name Skuzzlebutt, I have to say, a lot of people, your generation
I know what a
definitely,
Skuzzlebutt is.
you know what Skuzzlebutt is, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
this is where the name came from. Is just like I mentioned, a few questions ago that there are not a lot of people like me, like us in Colorado or Maryland or New Hampshire, and so for a very long time, I've just felt like a freak, an outcast. Like I don't really fit in. I really stand out like a sore thumb in a crowd, and also very misunderstood. Like being like me in a university and in a PhD program, you really stick out, and a lot of people are like, okay, you don't really understand that.
Yeah.
And so I took this whole concept of being a cryptid, right, from Skuzzlebutt, from the second episode of South Park, especially living where Matt Stone and Trey Parker lived when they were making this episode, right?
Yeah.
The whole idea of Skuzzlebutt is that he's just like this Bigfoot-like creature in the mountains. People tell horror stories of him. No one understands him. But at the end of the episode, he saves the kids from the volcanic eruption, and then as a thank you, they shoot him, right? And
Yeah.
so like it's just this like really tragic story of like this freak in the mountains who really wasn't harmful. He was pretty harmless, and he just wanted to help. And when he helped, people shot him. And there's just something poetic to that story, that I think, because it's a part of South Park, that part of it gets overlooked because it is just the punchline of they shot Bigfoot.
Yeah.
But I was also really inspired by just that idea of, the misunderstood cryptid in the mountains, who's also playing mountain music. And so that's where all these things sort of came together. But above all, the name Skuzzlebutt also sets up this little sense of humor, where there is a problem in the dark folk scene of a little too much pretentious, right? Sometimes things can get a little too much pretense around it, right?
Yeah.
People take themselves a little too seriously, which is fine. But I never wanted to play music under the pretense that I'm serious. This is all very mystical and magical, and look at how interesting and esoteric I am. And so Skuzzlebutt really just breaks down that wall immediately, where it's like, Skuzzlebutt, like you chuckle when you say it. And so for that's sort of like the really disorganized backstory of Skuzzlebutt.
So I don't know whether this is a good question or not, but I wonder whether you mixing the styles. So you've taken something from your culture and mixed it with the Nordic culture. So
Yes.
does that avoid being accused of things like cultural appropriation, which is often done? So are you making it your own by mixing the two together? I don't.
So it's actually really funny you bring this up, because cultural appropriation sort of is one of the hallmarks of ethnomusicology, is talking about how it functions, what are the different ways. And appropriation is sort of like a weird thing where it has become almost intrinsically negative, when appropriation also just means taking ownership, or taking or something like that. But in a lot of ways, it depends on two things. Like mostly power dynamics is what people ultimately use to judge if cultural appropriation is being done wrong or not. Is someone more powerful taking from someone less powerful, right? So exploitation. So in that case, I wouldn't say that there's too much of an exploitation or power dynamic going on, especially because, for all intents and purposes, I'm friends with these musicians, and I'm part of the culture in a lot of ways. But the question is there. It's also just like how respectfully is it done? Because there is also a lot of disrespectful appropriation of Nordic culture that happens from non-Nordic musicians. I see it all the time. And it's weird, and you kind of get the icky feeling when you see it happen, right?
Yeah.
And I would just think that while you could classify what I'm doing maybe as cultural appropriation a little bit, I think that what I'm ultimately doing is using a tradition that I'm a part of to create music that's meaningful for myself. Because especially cultural appropriation tends to be more typically used with traditional culture. So if I were to be taking someone else's traditional culture and really messing with it, and the interesting thing about this type of music is it's not really a traditional culture. It is very much like a more modern or like popular culture. And we could get into the details of what the difference is there, but I don't know if we want to go down that rabbit hole. But I've never been accused of it, and I think that's just because I'm a part of both cultures. I'm both a bluegrass
Yeah.
musician, and I'm pretty comfortably in the Nordic scene too. So,
But I think, yeah, but as I say, because you've put your own spin on it as well, you're not
Mhm.
just making a carbon copy. You do see bands that, again, not to use the same example all the time, but you hear
Mhm.
people that sound like Ina Selvig. They try to replicate
Mhm.
that sound, right? Whereas if you're going your own way with the mask, with the banjo, yeah, I think
I mean,
it's
like, yeah, it would be interesting because I don't even know if I would call that, because if someone were to really try and imitate Einar Selvik, I still don't think that would venture into cultural appropriation, because it's
mm,
not so much that it's cultural material that's being appropriated. So if you look at other instances of cultural appropriation, if you look at um, you know white people wearing Indian headdresses for Halloween, right? Or sort of like the football logo for the Redskins, or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Um, there's very clearly some, because of the history of the treatment of Native Americans here in the States, and then just being turned around and being used for a sports logo or a Halloween costume. That's cultural appropriation, because you're taking the cultural material that is a headdress and sort of appropriating that for your own profit, your own gain, and all of that. If someone
yeah,
were to do a really blatant cover of a Vardruna tune, that would be more on the basis of, is this copyright,
yeah.
or is this just like flagrant imitation? I don't
Mm.
think it would go into the grounds of cultural appropriation necessarily, but that's a whole rabbit hole of both sociology and ethnomusicology that we'd be here for hours.
So am I right in thinking, because the banjo did that start off as an Afro-American instrument? Is that right?
Yeah, so the banjo has a really fascinating history because it feels like every 10 years we learn something new about where it comes from. Um, the banjo, as it stands, came from the Caribbean. It was, and what I will say is that I do believe that its origins are in West Africa, just because you look at a bunch of instruments in West Africa, and not only are they set up the same way, but they also, what I'll say for anyone listening who doesn't know what claw hammer banjo is, it's a style of banjo where you either grow out this fingernail or you put on a finger pick and you literally hammer the string like this, right? Where you're, instead of playing with a pick, you use your finger and you downstroke, right? And
Mm.
there are so many string instruments in West Africa where you see people play it and it's with a long fingernail downstroking, even if it's not a banjo. So the play style also, I would say, pretty clearly comes from West Africa. But the banjo itself is a really simple instrument, and we actually can find parallels to the banjo all around the world. Um, there's, the Japanese have their own style of string instrument from back in the day that very closely represents the banjo. Um, and I am blanking on it, despite being in the Japanese ensemble last year. I am shamisen, the shamisen. The shamisen is very closely related visually and construction wise to a banjo as well. Because it's just a simple idea of an instrument. You take a box that has a membrane over it and you put strings over it, and you have something very similar to a banjo. But just over time, the banjo became so spread out across, particularly Appalachia, and there were so many integrated communities in Appalachia of recently freed slaves, but then also the poor coal miners, having to really coexist within communities in Appalachia, that it really is an American instrument in a lot of ways. It's just the problem is that over time it became a white instrument. If you
Right.
think of Deliverance, right? You think of Deliverance of the hillbillies playing
Yeah.
with dueling banjos. The problem is that over time, white culture took almost complete ownership of it, And it was really only in the last 10 or 20 years or so where, especially I'm thinking of Rhiannon Giddens, who's just one of my absolute favorite banjo players. She's been doing a lot of work in sort of bringing back to the forefront the Black history of the banjo. So in a lot of ways, I just think that it's the most quintessentially American instrument just because of how complicated its history is, and also just because of how multicultural it has become, right? And so in a lot of ways, the banjo is a symbol of American music to me just because of how messy, but also how just hybrid that the history of the instrument is.
When I think of the banjo, I think of Stewie Griffin.
Oh yeah. Yep.
I got blisters on these fingers.
On these fingers. Yep. Yeah. So that would be the style of banjo that became popular in the 40s with bluegrass. And so that's just another example. There are many different ways to play it. It's been used in so many different genres and styles. So it's a very versatile instrument. And that's why I've been able to, mess around with it to try and get like a more archaic sound out of it, I think.
So I'm going to skip a few of my questions because I can see the time getting on, and I know you've got
okay.
limited amount of time. But one more thing on Skuzzlebutt was just: do you think there's any chance we'll ever see Skuzzlebutt perform at Midgard's-Blot?
It would be fun. I think there is probably some overlap of fans. Just if I look at my Spotify thing where it says, people also listen to, it's pretty much Midgard's-Blot bands. So, I think there could be a good chance. I just don't know. If you were to have asked me this question a few months ago, I would have said probably not. But considering this year they have not only Leadfoot, who is a dark Americana guy, but also the Texas Cornflake Massacre. I think that now my answer would be, if they would invite me to play, I would play Midgard's-Blot. But but at the same time, I've also got press work to do and all that. It'd be interesting to show up. We opened up this interview saying the man of many hats. It would be funny if I had to show up to Midgard's-Blot with every hat. You know what I mean? I bring the banjo and I will be playing around the bonfire with I play down at the camp just to sort of pass the time and all that. But yeah.
All right, so I don't know if you know, but there are 7 questions that I ask every guest just to round off the show.
The surprise questions. Let's do it.
All right, so the first one is, if you had an unlimited budget, what would be your dream project?
An unlimited budget, what would be my dream project? I love this. I would probably do that's fine. Dude, you were right. Yeah, these are surprising. Let me give this 1 second. So my first thought would be, I would probably finally invest myself in traditional Scandinavian instruments that I've always wanted. The Hardanger fiddle and the nyckelharpa are 2 traditional Scandinavian instruments that were sort of my gateway drug into traditional Scandinavian culture. I didn't really talk about that in your earlier questions, but my first love of Scandinavian music was the folk music, fiddling and folk dance and all that. But those instruments are not cheap, and so I don't have any, but I would love to learn them and play them. So maybe if I had an unlimited budget, my first answer would be to actually get those instruments and then sort of see what I could do musically between those instruments and the banjo. I'll land on that answer for the time being, because that's what comes to mind first, and also something that it'd be really fun to play around with.
All right. Next question. Do you think you could survive on a Viking Age diet?
So this is when I'll turn the question back on you, because I have my idea of what the Viking Age diet is, which I'm assuming is a lot of hearty vegetables that are pickled for most of the year, fermented for most of the year. They don't have potatoes yet.
Nope.
Or tomatoes.
Nope.
You're
doing good so far.
Fish. A lot of fish.
That probably depends more on where you live.
Oh, where? Yeah.
If you've got a fresh fish, that is. Obviously, you could have salted fish, but.
So I am here's something funny. I'm actually quite a foodie myself, and this is why I love the work that you do. I used to be a butcher, and I sold a lot of fish, and I would get to take home fish that might have been, 1 day late. Can't sell it
Yeah.
anymore. And I grew up on the Chesapeake Bay, so I grew up eating a lot of fish, but I also ferment my own vegetables here at home.
I
I
actually
work at
had
the
some
farm.
questions on this that I've skipped over.
Oh, I mean, like, dude, you can feel free to ask. If you want to talk about this a little bit, I've got some more time.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm just going
yeah.
to
What did you
bring up the
What did you want to
fact
know about the
because
fermented stuff?
I've seen a couple of things on your Facebook over the
Yeah,
last, I don't know, 6 months or so that we've been planning to do this. And one
yeah.
was you mentioned about, I think you'd seen a talk on fermentation, but it was referred to as
Oh,
microanimism.
that was not me. So that was someone else, and I really wish I had her name off the top of my head. But she gave a talk at the festival Fire in the Mountains in 2021, which is a metal
Right.
festival that happens at the Grand Tetons, and they took a lot of inspiration from Midgardsblot because both of the organizers go to Midgardsblot. So
Okay.
Fire in the Mountains was in a lot of ways their way of trying to have a similar festival in the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was the most memorable talk was a microbiologist who gave a talk on microanimism, where a lot of people, if you want to think about like Runa's version of Nordic animism, a lot of it is
Mm.
big picture stuff: trees, animals, rivers, seasons, all of that sort of thing. But she was like, what about the little spirits, literally spirits, right? If you think about what you call
Yeah.
fermented liquor, right? And she, did a whole thing on like that's where a lot of the reasons we call it spirits, right, is because of that history. But also when you ferment things, there are these little spirits that go into it and sort of like preserve it and sort of give it their blessing in a way. Um, and that's also why salt throws away bad luck. Or if you drop salt, it's bad luck. Or if you want to prevent being cursed or visited by a ghost or something, you
Yeah.
put salt outside because salt keeps the bad spirits away. So the whole idea is that looking at fermentation, you can see a whole new level of animism that actually has a more immediate effect on your daily life. Ferment, like, it's the process that gives you bread, gives you beer, gives you the cheeses you love, gives you pickles. And
Yeah.
this is it's a frame that sort of took the idea of animism and put it on a more relatable day-to-day basis that a lot of people probably don't pay too much attention to. And that was just really inspiring to me. I was like, hell yeah, I'm gonna start fermenting stuff because I want to like interact more with those spirits. Yeah, if I could be a little
Yeah.
bit more
Yeah.
of a hippie about it.
Yeah. I've never considered it from that angle. If you ever remember their name, maybe I should get them on to have a proper
Oh
chat
yeah, I
about
mean,
it.
like if I could bring up the program because they definitely still have the program up, or I could just message Alex and ask. But yeah, I'd love
Yeah.
to give you the name because I think it'd be an interesting talk.
Yeah. The other one I was going to mention was I think it was only about a week ago, is you had a bit of a what I'd call a rant on Facebook about traditional knowledge.
Yeah, yeah.
I thought it was worth just bringing that one up. Yeah, because you seem to have quite strong opinions.
Yeah, so it's just like living in. I would say that in the Western world, the United States probably has the most deplorable food system
Mm.
of the Western world, and it's just like so many European friends are like, "How do you eat these things? Like, this isn't food." And especially looking at how at also the health problems that America is facing, right? And I know that the UK is starting to face a lot of the similar ones as well.
Yeah,
But that's our invention, is horrible health based on eating fake food. That is the American
we'll let you
pride
have
right there.
it. We'll blame you for
Yeah,
it.
and so we just have like a really unhealthy relationship with our food, and
Yeah,
that's really, if you look at a place like the Bible Belt in the United States, which is where most of the health problem is at the moment, it's
mm.
also the largest food desert in the United States. And that is, a food desert is just they do not have access to fresh food, really.
Yeah,
Most of what they're eating is like frozen meals, or they're getting fast food or something like that. And so right now, the Bible Belt is in a lot of ways like a control group for this is what happens when you completely rely on industrial food to survive. You get every health problem under the
yeah,
sun, right? And so food to me is just like music, food, traditional food and traditional music are a lot of ways to sort of stay rooted a little bit in a little bit of self-sufficiency, of being able to take care of yourself and to be able to like understand those who came before you. And because a
yeah,
lot of people, a lot of our food knowledge has been developed over millennia of people doing trial and error. And if we all just forget about how to do that because it's easier to buy something at the store, we do risk that food knowledge becoming not extinct, because there's always books, you know what I mean? But at least it falls out of just common knowledge. And I think things and as important as learning how to preserve your vegetables or, make bread, those are pretty
Mm.
important skills to have. I just think it's important. So
Yeah, yeah, no, it's good. I do think they fall out of fashion pretty quickly too, right? I mean, like I teach deer butchery to people, and realistically, it wasn't that long ago that people were used to doing that themselves anyway.
yep.
And now we just buy it pre-packaged from a supermarket. And I think people are coming back, particularly probably more so after lockdown and things. People got a bit more into being outdoors, more
Mhm.
foraging, that kind of stuff. So
Yep.
maybe it's picking up again. But yeah, there's definitely, I think it could be lost fairly quickly. I don't think it would take long.
Yeah, I mean, like, especially, you said recently it's coming back. I just think the pandemic, not to harp
Mm,
on that too much because I know that now comes up in like every conversation, but I do think there is something significant to the fact that I think the pandemic showed how fragile things are.
yeah.
And the people who have the ability to do so are sort of getting back into learning self-sufficiency, learning how, what food around me can I eat myself, what can I forage, how can I make
Mm,
my own bread. That I remember, in the early days of the pandemic, everyone was learning how to do sourdough. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
that was the thing everyone was doing. And it's funny
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
Alyssa's a baker. And so
Mm,
she was like, finally, people are seeing how much fun it is. But then everyone stopped doing it after like 2 months and they realized how much of a pain it is, right?
yeah.
So I think there's a latent feeling from the pandemic where people want to be a little bit more self-sufficient if things just go to shit again, which they could and probably will. And that's why I try to practice a little bit self-sufficiency with this food knowledge too. Also,
Mm.
just because if you rely on the supermarket for everything you need, especially here in the States, you're probably going to die a few years younger, which is just an unfortunate reality.
Like we've kept chickens now for probably might be as much as 20 years, 15, 20 years, I'd have said. I don't know. A long,
I'm
long
so
time.
jealous.
But we moved house just before the pandemic, not knowing what was
Mhm.
coming. So we left the chickens with the new
Oh
homeowner and
no.
said, it's a bit stressful for the hens. Do you want them? And they said, yes. So like, fine, we'll give them with the sale. We'll set ourselves up again fresh. Pandemic hits. Could I get a chicken? Nope. I was waiting for months and months for chickens because everyone wanted chickens.
Yeah, it was a wake up call for a lot of people, and I think in a really good way. Just for that, but that is the very thin silver lining to that whole
Yeah.
that whole
I
situation. But
I think as well, I think that initial thing has started to tail off a little bit again. I think
hundred
like you're
percent,
saying, like making bread and getting chickens. I think yeah, even dogs. I mean, a lot of people got dogs in the pandemic, right? And then they went back to work and go, oh, this isn't quite
yep,
so easy now.
yeah, a lot of that happening too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But anyway,
so
digress.
I guess to answer your question, yeah, it's just sort of, I think the traditional food knowledge just fits into just also my larger love of just traditional knowledge in general. Sort of looking at what we can still learn from it today and sort of
Mm,
doing our role as tradition bearers. Because when you participate in tradition in that way, there is this agreement that you will also be keeping the knowledge safe for who comes next. And so in a lot of ways, food is just another way for me to sort of like take knowledge that I can pass on to whoever comes next. Because if I don't pass it on, then that stops with me, right?
yeah, sure. So back to the original question is, do you think you
Yeah.
can survive on a bacon eggs diet?
I am, so I will answer this in the affirmative under some facts, right? I'm not a picky eater.
Yeah,
I will eat some pretty rancid stuff. When I was a butcher, I would take home some stuff that we could not sell, right? And I would eat
yeah,
it and I'd be fine.
yeah,
So I would say that because I'm a pretty versatile eater, and I'm not picky at all. I would say that I could survive on a Viking age diet. I actually think it'd be more about quantity that would be my
yeah,
problem because
yeah,
I eat a lot and I
yeah.
don't gain weight. So I have a heavy appetite. So that would be,
Everyone
I
just
think, the
turned off.
biggest variable. I know they're like, this son of a bitch.
um, So yeah, so connected to that question, there's a follow-on, which is there any food you'd miss on a Viking Age diet?
Oh yeah. Definitely the different kinds of cheeses. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you're not going to have something like, cheddar
Yeah.
or blue cheese or something like that. And I know cheese is a really basic answer to that I feel like is pretty common. But
Mm.
also just like all the different ingredients that you take for granted in a modern kitchen, like your spice cabinet,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
or how valuable salt is, getting back to that last conversation. Sometimes you might just not have enough salt to like make something taste as good as you would want it to taste. Maybe. I don't really know much about the availability of salt. But I think it would be basic ingredients like that I would miss.
I don't know if I've mentioned it on this show before, because I have this idea that everyone says that salt was expensive, and I don't think it was. I think it was just valuable, right?
Yep.
Because you need it to preserve your food. So you're not,
Mhm.
quote unquote, putting it on your chips, right? Because you need it for more important things. But also the food you're eating, if it's been, dried, salted in some way, you don't need to add salt to it because it's already salty. The cheese has been salted, the butter's been salted. You're not adding
Yep.
more salt for that reason. And I think, I don't know, I'm sure there's someone that could tell me better, but I can't find any evidence that it was expensive. It was being mined as right back in the Bronze Age, they're mining it.
Yep.
There's a trade for it. I mean, the Roman soldiers were paid in it. That's where salary comes from. But that
Mhm.
doesn't mean it's expensive. That just means you're willing to work for it, right?
Yeah, it does. So I would say that, yeah, then maybe not salt. I think you have a good point. I think it's also, again, dependent on where you are, because I feel like if you're on the coast,
Yeah.
salt's a lot easier to come by. Um, but yeah, so
Yeah.
I would say like also just a basic answer like sugar.
Yeah.
Sugar's a pretty basic one.
Yeah.
I love sugar. I have
Yeah.
trouble. Well, this is a pastry chef, like
Yeah.
croissants. I'd miss that.
Yeah.
Oh, coffee. Coffee would 100% be my answer. My final answer, coffee. I drink way too
Fair
much
enough.
of it. It's my vice. I need it. So, yeah, coffee.
So next question is the strangest one on the list, I'll be honest. What's the
Good.
weirdest thing in your kitchen,
At the moment,
if you like?
Alyssa is playing
Yeah.
with a sourdough starter made from apples,
Hmm.
where she has learned that you can actually start the same culture if you just ferment apples in a certain way. So right now there's a really big jar sitting on our counter that just has apple peels in it, and it's real bubbly and real foamy. Um, I would say that's the weirdest thing in our kitchen right now. Yeah.
Cool. What is the worst food or drink you've ever eaten?
Yeah, so I'm gonna make this one specifically Nordic. That fermented shark fin or whatever it is, the fermented shark that Icelanders eat.
Hakal?
Screw that. That
Yeah.
was awful. That was the worst thing. And they had me try it in public. I was at, I don't know if you remember this, but me and Matthias helped work on an Icelandic musical that premiered in Jackson Hole in Wyoming. And when
All
we were
right.
there to celebrate the occasion, someone brought Hakal there, and we were in public. We were at a bar, and they pulled it out. They had permission from the bar owner because they were good friends, and they said, "Hey, you got to try this." And everyone's staring at me. I'm like, "I know what this is. I don't want to eat it." And then just when you have a dozen friends staring at you, you're like, "Fine, I'll play along." And it's just the
Yeah.
way that Hakal violates you by just every sensory organ you have is just ammonia.
Yeah.
It just, I hated that. I can't recall another food that just infiltrated every sense that I had and made me so uncomfortable as that food. I'm glad I tried it once. I will then also, of course, try strumming whenever I'm in Sweden and it's offered to me.
Oh,
But
that's worse.
it is worse. Good.
That's
I'm looking
worse.
forward to it. But yeah, Hakal far and
Oh,
away is the worst thing I've ever eaten.
I gave Hakal to Dan,
Oh,
Nordic Mythology podcast, on this show.
oh, that's great.
Yeah, when he was on, we did. It was in York. And I was like, well, we can't, because originally when I started the show, I was cooking with people or cooking food, sharing food,
Mhm.
right? It's quite difficult to do in the long term, but we started that way. So I was like, well, I can't cook with Dan. What are we going to do? So I said, all right, I'm going to bring him something that I've made, something that he's made, and something that I've bought. So the hackle was what I bought. He made butter by hand behind the Minster in York.
That's adorable.
And that blew his mind. And that's hackle. What was the other one? Oh, I bought some alcohol that I'd made. I think it was a sizer, just to wash away
Okay.
the alcohol.
Yeah. Oh, I was given an Iceland. Iceland has the food. Yeah. So Iceland has all the food that I've hated because Matthias also gave me to try the liquor Opal from
Oh,
Iceland that just tastes like all the worst. It tastes like fermented licorice in the worst way possible. Um, and I really hated that too. So,
sorry, Iceland.
yeah,
It's come
sorry,
up
Iceland, but
before.
you're, yeah,
Not the first time.
yeah. But you know,
Um,
when the climate's tough, you just gotta eat what you gotta eat.
yeah. So we've got two more. We've got what's the
Okay.
most memorable meal you've ever had?
Most memorable meal I've ever had. That would I'm gonna say I'm gonna be a little bit I'm gonna be a little maybe corny or nostalgic about this one, but growing up on the Chesapeake in Maryland, you pretty much grow up with crab feasts where the Chesapeake Bay has like some of the best crab you can ever eat.
Really?
Um, and so I would actually say that any crab feast I had growing up, with my family and with friends and all that, that would just have to go for like the most memorable meal was just any one of them because it's a whole ritual in Maryland where you during crab season, which is over the summer, you get all your friends together and you line a table with newspaper and it'll be obvious why in a second. And so you cushion the table with newspaper, then you dump out a massive bag of crabs, and everyone has a hammer, and you use the hammer to crack open the crab to get into the meat. And so the newspaper is there to keep the hammers from like denting the table or the crab shells from scuffing up the table. And
Yeah.
that's a meal that if you were sitting down eating with yourself, be like 30 minutes, 20 minutes. But when you're with people, with family, you're all out there for hours, just like talking, drinking beer, cracking open crabs. And yeah, it's if anyone here has never experienced a Maryland crab feast, that's definitely something that you'd want to experience once in your life. And I was lucky enough to grow up with those.
It sounds lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, really
Really
is.
nice. Yeah. It's that communal aspect as well. It's like we've got a pizza oven, we make pizza and everyone gets around and
Mhm.
everyone chats and has a beer whilst I make the pizza. It's yeah,
Oh yeah, very much
very
so.
nice. Mm. All right. So the last question is when you die, your relatives are preparing your grave goods. What food and drink are you taking to feast in Valhalla?
This is great. Okay, so what food and drink? So the drink is going to be pretty straightforward. The drink is going to be Coors. I am not a
Yeah.
beer snob, and I just live where they make Coors. And so it's just
Yeah.
what I've been drinking, and I'm very unapologetically a Coors guy. So it's probably going to be like a 12
Okay.
pack of Coors.
Yeah.
But then the food would probably that's really funny because it's usually like a dry good of some kind, right? That would be in the
I've had
grave
all sorts
goods.
of answers on this.
Oh yeah. Okay. So if anything goes,
Yeah.
if anything goes, I would probably have to say some kind of uh smoked salmon because I'm just a huge seafood guy, and that's just that would be the food. So cores and smoked salmon.
Classy.
Yeah, right.
Nice. I don't know if you want to give yourself a quick social media plug or anything like that before we go, or maybe
Oh,
remind
sure.
everyone where they can find your music.
Yeah. So if you're interested in learning more about Nordic music, you can follow me on Instagram at Nordic Sound Channel. And if you were interested in Skuzzlebutt at all, Pagan Banjo is sort of like the the slogan for it or something like that. You can follow me on Instagram at Banjo Druid. And both of those are also very, very active on YouTube as well. So that's where you can find me.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today. been a lot of fun.
Yeah, Craig, thank you so much for having me, man. It's been a really great time.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye. If you enjoyed the show and want to hear more, remember to like and subscribe and give the show a rating. You can also help keep the show going by becoming a Patreon, where you'll get early access to all episodes. Or check out my range of merch on my store. Links are in the episode description. Thanks for watching.